Hi, my name is Fred. Welcome to the Epic Endurance Podcast. I'm the head coach at Yousuli. Today we are going to talk about critical power and how to go beyond the 95%. First, before we do that, I think it's important to understand what is FTP, functional threshold power, how it's being used, and its actual definition. FTP comes from the work of Kogan and Allen, who were trying to simplify measurements made for cycling and give the idea of a number that could be used as a reference for or close to the anaerobic power. The actual definition of FTP or functional threshold power is the highest sustainable power for approximately 1 hour. Now, a lot of athletes and coaches do miss this notion of approximately. FTP is not 1 hour power. FTP is meant to stand as a way to look through the lens of work at the value above which the body is going to start fading rapidly. To calculate FTP is fairly simple. You do a ride at your best effort for 20-minute time trial, and then you remove 5% of this value. So your 95% of this value will be your FTP, and most athletes and coaches will use this number to generate training zones or racing zones based on a percentage of FTP. Let's say if your power for 20 minutes was about 200 watts, then your FTP will be 190 watts. 5% less. FTP is easy to calculate, though it is not always very precise. It did help athletes for quite a long time to get a quick measure of their fitness by comparing their best 20-minute efforts, as well as defining training zones or potential pacing zones based on these values. The problem that FTP has is that it does not look at the anaerobic contribution into this 20 minutes. Some athletes will be stronger and will have the ability to overinflate their FTP due to their power. Their anaerobic power is not something that they will be able to use over 3 hours, but might affect to a certain extent their 20-minute power. So since FTP is only looking at one value, it fails to take into account the nuances of your power distribution. This is where critical power comes into place, and critical power is mostly being used by sports scientists and physiologists, and basically critical power will be also in theory the point power which will be sustained indefinitely. Of course, this is not the case. In theory, your critical power and FTP are looking for the same point, the point above which things start to fade pretty quickly. Critical power is looking at the behavior of your power on, let's say, a short, medium, and slightly longer interval. Doing critical power testing is usually less painful than doing a 20-minute time trial and gives better result. Why? Because critical power is not only looking at this fading point, but also at how much your anaerobic system is contributing. Now, we talk about the anaerobic system and the aerobic system, and I think it's important, again, to redefine these things quite quickly. There is an allegory that I often use, is the allegory of a hybrid electric car that can be run on different kind of energy sources, at low intensities, mostly using electric, going into the highway, switching both electric and some fuel, and having the ability to turn on a turbo mode for 10 or 20 seconds. For us, it's about the same. We do have this aerobic system, which will be the battery, and something which in theory can be used for very, very long durations. We do have this anaerobic system, which is primarily using carbohydrates that will be the equivalent of fuel, and we'll have our turbo or nitrogen that will be the equivalent of what we call the phosphocreatine pathway. When we do mathematical models of power, we are trying to understand, again, what is this anaerobic contribution into performance. This is something that we call W prime. W prime is a finite amount of energy, a bit like if you have a 1 liter water bottle and you can choose to pour it quickly, or you can choose to pour it over 3, 4, 5, or maybe 10 minutes, but the amount of water that you have into this bottle is limited. So if we look at our power duration curve, which usually we put things with the highest intensity on the left, you will have very high value on the left side, and most of the power produced on this side is going to come from ATP PC system, photocreatine system, PCR pathway, and then the anaerobic system, which will be anaerobic glycolysis, and the aerobic system. Systems all work all together at the same time. W prime is a theoretical value. If we look at the 1 minute power, let's say that 95% or 98% of this is going to come from your anaerobic system, but maybe 2 or 3 or 4% are going to come from the aerobic system, which is trying to produce energy. So now we have a little understanding of what is the power duration curve, what is the anaerobic contribution, and on the power duration curve, what most athletes try to do is to look for the quasi-sustainable points, which can be called FTP or can be ideally called a critical power. FTP, CP, LT2, lactate threshold 2, all refer to different physiological changes or performance changes that occur, but are mostly talking about the same point. If we look at the lactate threshold, we're looking at difference in lactate, and the lactate changes are going to be impacted by which metabolic system is being used. If we're looking at respiratory changes, it's going to be maybe a difference between oxygen and CO2. There are many ways to try to find these points, but at the end of the day, anaerobic threshold is one of the values that most athletes are trying to look at. There is another important value that a lot of athletes are forgetting, is the aerobic threshold. The aerobic threshold is when the energy produced is shifting from a predominantly fat-based energy production, so the oxidative pathway, to an increasingly more anaerobic system which uses a bit more and more sugar. At the aerobic threshold, we utilize about 50% of fat and 50% of sugar, glycogen. For endurance athletes, maximizing this aerobic threshold is extremely important, if not more important actually than maximizing their anaerobic threshold. Unfortunately, in most cases, it's quite tricky to estimate based on performance. We can look at heart rate behaviors, we can look at like percentage of the anaerobic threshold or critical power. People will look at a percentage of FTP, but again, this variation can vary quite a bit. The relationship between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold will depend on how much an athlete is trained and what kind of training they do. And an ideally trained athlete will be able to bring their aerobic threshold closer to their anaerobic threshold. So their zone 3, the zone in between these 2 points, their zone 3 in terms of training will be smaller. When everything tends to be a bit tighter and when athletes are able to utilize and have a greater range in the oxidative pathway onto the aerobic system and produce energy with oxygen, the amount of effort that is being required to produce energy is low, and this is becoming extremely sustainable. Now for 20-minute time trial, or obviously values like the anaerobic threshold or your W prime might be more relevant. I'm going to show you a small calculator if you want to go beyond the 95%. This is called a critical power calculator. And basically, this is a quick way to look at critical power using 3 points, which will be max sustainable effort. I recommend working with values between 2 to 3 minutes, 5 and 7, and 12 to 15. The idea is really to try to fail within this range. It doesn't have to be approximately this range, but it works a bit better here. These tests doesn't have to be done on the same day. You can run 3 tests in a week, for example. What we're looking for is failure. And so, you cannot win, you want to fail. Let's take these values. Let's say that we're doing 400 watts for about 2 minutes, 350 watts for about 5 minutes, and 320 watts for about 720 seconds. This calculator will give us some range of things. So we have our CP, our critical power, based on these points will be around 307 watts. We have our W prime expressed in kilojoule, which will be around 11.22. Usually these values vary between 6 and 12. So this is quite a high value, meaning that like I have a strong contribution from the anaerobic side. Here we'll have a range for the aerobic threshold. So like not the CP, the aerobic threshold, where fats and carbohydrate utilization are about equal. And you see this range is quite big here. And so, yeah, we have this one. We'll talk about this. This is a pretty interesting number. We'll talk about it in a second. Something that is pretty cool to do with when you have CP and when you have W prime is looking at what will be your best power based on, let's say, a set duration time. So you want to do something for 350 seconds long. If you wanted to empty this bottle, empty this tank as fast as possible, you should be able to produce 339 watts. I find this to be very often very accurate. So when we are looking at runners on a 5K course or shorter, or cyclists doing time trial, these values are actually pretty spot on. So there might be variations if the course is demanding an effort, but especially when you're talking about values that are above your critical power, so for shorter things. And again, like what will be, this is going to give you a crazy number here, but let's say you wanted to do a value 320 watts, and it'll tell you you're able to last for 923 seconds. This will work only when you use values above CP. So this is again for anything which is for shorter duration. Anything that goes below that, so if you were going to, let's say your CP is 307 watts, and you say I want to do 200 watts, it doesn't really understand what's happening. We're talking about the rate of fatigue is going to be dependent on other things. Now, obviously, we are within the aerobic range, probably, so you should be able to sustain this for quite some time. There might be other elements that might play with fatigue, such as mental fatigue, your ability to absorb carbohydrate to hydrate, heat, and other factors that can play. Normally and theoretically, if we're just looking at the numbers, anything below CP should be able to be sustained for very long durations. You can find here below some training zones. So an easy zone, which will be mostly for recovery rides, so after a race or in between intervals. I'm breaking down what people call zone 2 here. We're still within the range of 184 to 233, but I've broken this down into 3 segments based on the amount of work. And the strongest correlation I can find between this range and if you want to move up is the amount of work. I'm sorry, this should not be zone 3, it should be zone 2. I'll fix this. But the amount of work you do at easy zone. So if you do a lot of riding, if you're spending, let's say, 10 hours per week just on zone 2 training and doing other things, then you're going to creep up quite quickly into the highest of these 3. On the other side, if you never do any easy training, then you're probably going to stay on the lowest part. So this is a big difference, and yeah, this is actually quite important. That's why people do recommend doing some easy work. Endurance, so this can be often a zone that is being targeted during specific races, as this is a zone below threshold, which will be something that you can hold for anywhere between 35 minutes to 1 hour and a half. The endurance zone is often a racing zone. People that do sprint triathlon will be mostly on threshold or super threshold. People that do like very short distances. People that like are aiming again for something where the power is going to be within this 35 to 1 hour and a half range and are very well conditioned, will be probably trying to stay at threshold and see how it impacts their run. Obviously, this might impact your run if you're doing triathlon. If you're using this for running, and it works pretty much the same, so you can try to visualize and staying at threshold. Supra threshold will be a couple of points above threshold. There are advantages to stay here, as it helps also override the system, but of course most of the work should be done around there. And then you have power VO2 max, not VO2 max, so estimated based on the power duration curve of the 3 points we have here, and anything above that will be your power. Now, if I compare this to me using things like VO2 Master to look at gas exchange, it does usually fall within this. Obviously, using physiological testing is more precise and will give us a very good notion of where the aerobic threshold is, where the anaerobic threshold is, where VO2 max or powered VO2 max is. Also, using these kind of system to test is not looking at performance or work, but looking at the effort. What we do is like we're looking at how the air exchange or how physiological markers are behaving through different intensities, and then we're mapping this to how much work or how much performance they were able to generate. If you remember the video I did on the 3 pillars, you'll understand that effort, work, and performance are 3 different things, but they can be mapped. I think this kind of calculation is fairly accurate and is a much better way to look at your functional threshold and to create zones for improving the efficiency of your training. It does often fall within the ballpark of what I will find with a gas exchange / physio test looking at oxygen saturation and whatnot. And yeah, I hope that this is helpful. I hope that I did not make this too complicated. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, leave me a message, and I will see you next time. Thank you.